Let's talk about Bryan Kohberger's books. The book that was seized by the FBI when they went through Bryan's Pennsylvania home that he shares with his parents, or at least used to share. It was so crucial they listed it as number 2, the number 2 item on this property list. Only after number 1, a knife. Obviously not the knife. It wasn't the K-bar knife, but they listed a book as number 2 after that knife. So what was this book? I was sent on a journey today to research it, as more and more evidence should start to come in Bryan Kohberger's case. Okay, so last night I was drifting in and out of sleep, listening to great interviews on the YouTube channel named The Interview Room. So it was titled How Bryan Kohberger Stacks Up Against Elliot Rodger, Other Serial Killers. So it sent me on this journey today is Monday, July 7th, to dig back into what type of book, what type of criminology book would it be, potentially criminology book, that Bryan may have found so critical, so urgent that he underlined a passage on page 118. After all, now that Bryan has entered a guilty plea, and we know the gag order will eventually drop someday soon, hopefully, perhaps on the 23rd, we know evidence will start rolling in. These things that have been mysteries to us for years now will start to become clearer. Some mysteries will be solved, of course, likely not all of them. We might get closer to answering the question, why? Why would such a sick mind harm 4 beautiful individuals, Ethan Chapin, Xana Kernodle, Kaylee Gonzalez, and Maddie Mogan? Who was his target? Well, I feel like the evidence will start rolling in. Just 1 hour ago, I got a reply from the Idaho State Police, a reply from one of the many agencies I've sent so many FOIAs into. They requested an extension required. So in 10 days, they'll tell me something. I don't know what. Maybe they'll tell me, like Pullman Police, yeah, you'll get that info by March 2026 or earlier. Who knows what they'll tell me? But until we start getting more concrete answers, let's figure out what we know so far from the evidence released. So the second item seized by the FBI from Bryan Kohberger's Pennsylvania home he shares with his parents, or he used to share. Obviously, he'll be on his way out of that Ada County jail over to some Idaho prison, or wherever they eventually land him, where he should live out the rest of his days. What, he's like 30 now. How long will he survive? Will he make it longer than other infamous prisoners made it? Will he be transferred to another prison? We'll see. But anyway, this book was seized December 30th, 2022. Book with underlining on page 118. What is this mysterious book? Well, according to a couple of great Redditor researchers, people, that great hive mind, that great collaborative effort, great collective knowledge, it might not have been Elliot Rodger's manifesto like some people assume. Perhaps it was all about Bundy, Bryan Kohberger, and his affinity towards Ted Bundy. Now, Bryan studied a lot of serial killers, and I'm sure all types of killers. Again, I guess Bryan won't be called a spree killer. I don't even know what we call him. But after watching Bryan Kohberger in court this past week, I don't think he necessarily enjoys the spotlight as much as Ted Bundy did. After all, Bryan didn't agree to sit through this long trial. He entered a guilty plea to avoid that death penalty and maybe avoid the spotlight. He didn't look too comfortable in court. He does look awkward, but it's not like he looked embarrassed or necessarily afraid, especially the one photo with him just staring headlong down the camera. It's so evil. It's like I don't even want to look at it that much. But Bryan, if he were the type who loved the spotlight, he might have kept his plea at not guilty, put the families and the victims' loved ones through this long drawn-out trial just so he could have gotten all the camera time, the live streaming time these days. So much different than when Bundy was on trial, when back in the 70s or so. Ted Bundy, he just ate up the attention. He loved just pontificating and smiling and trying to show off his good looks and show off his smarts, and he was like he was one of the lawyers. Even though Bundy and Bryan don't necessarily share those attributes, I believe there are some attributes that Bryan does share with Bundy, and it could be related to this page 118 in some mysterious book. So I've narrowed it down to 2 potential options. We will see at some point if I'm correct. Perhaps I could be way off. But option number 1, was it the book titled The Stranger Beside Me by Anne Rule, Published way back on June 29th, 2018, Ann Rule was a popular author, true crime author. Her experiences with Ted Bundy are amazing. We're going to go over those. Option 2. Could Bryan have read this weird book, The Masks of Ted Bundy, My Prison Interviews with the All-American Psycho Ted Bundy? So I've linked to all these below. That one was published paperback September 29th, 2022. Could Bryan have had it in his possession? We know cops already have his Amazon records. We know Bryan's Amazon movements after the murders on November 13th, 2022, when he got back home, the stuff he clicked on in Amazon. We know about that. Trying to replace that lost knife sheath. Well, did he purchase this book, The Masks of Ted Bundy? It was published September 29th, 2022. It's possible. Could Bryan have had this paperback? Could he have had it sent to him in Washington and then brought it back home with him where cops would find it towards the end of the year, 2022? Well, let's talk about both. The weird things about this book, The Masks of Ted Bundy. You know, you start reading it, and on the onset, it looks like, oh, this guy wrote a book. Dr. Paul Dawson. He brings his forensic clinical psychologist perspective to the Ted Bundy prison interviews, which he completed in 1988, and now are available for the first time in 30 years. It goes on to claim Dr. Dawson conducted a series of interviews with Ted Bundy, poster boy for mass murder monsters. In 1988, while he was on death row in the Florida State Prison at Stark, Florida. Well, it sounds interesting, and a person captured a screenshot of page 118 in this book. But when you look further into it, it looks like it's not legit. That doesn't mean Bryan still didn't potentially purchase this book and underline something on page 118. The dates line up. September 2022 was published and available. It could have been one of the books cops found in Bryan's house. What's strange is when I started researching all these potential excerpts from this book on page 118, it turns out they don't exist. So this alleged Dr. Dawson, did he just create some kind of Ted Bundy fan fiction? It's possible. I mean, people who just will not accept Bryan Kohberger's guilty plea, they're already coming up with wild theories. One person literally wrote on Twitter, maybe Xana was afraid of Ethan and Bryan showed up just to protect her and Ethan was the one who really did all the murders, and outlandish things are being said. So I wouldn't put it past someone to write a fake book about Ted Bundy because he did like to talk, he liked to give a lot of interviews, so people could be fooled. Even though it's fake, I believe. Could this have been the passage that Bryan read and underlined? Supposedly, Ted Bundy said, I'm not going to confess all my sins, but within a few years, those latent desires fueled by porn were expressed through my first murder, but I don't blame. Even though I can't find those exact quotations being said anywhere, because if Ted Bundy would have really said that, we would have had evidence of that in a bunch of different publications. It wouldn't only appear in this one random Amazon book. I do see the inference in what this person is writing. In the LA Times, there's this article where Bundy documented his early exposure to hardcore, saying that the material had a crystallizing effect on his violent tendencies and his eventual acting out of the fantasies he had seen depicted for so long. Bundy referred to the hardcore as the fuel for his fantasies. Remember on Dateline, we found out we were privy to some of the searches that Bryan Kohberger conducted prior to the murders. You know, he had all those weird photos of different women and himself in a hoodie. We learned that the woman who stayed with Bryan at least one night and they had worked together and she ended up being leery of him, that woman had written a paper about Ted Bundy. But we also learned Bryan's searches, it included stuff that wanted to see women sleeping or, incapacitated or what have you. And I can't help but wonder, did that lend itself to the time Bryan chose to appear at 1122 King Road? Maybe he didn't expect Xana to be awake, but did he want to encounter a sleeping Maddie, a sleeping Kaylee? Now, of course, the prosecutor in court said There was no SA in the literal sense. There was no SA. I believe potentially because Bryan didn't want to leave behind any DNA like that. However, in reading further, researching further, the close contact weapon, phallic type weapon that Bryan chose to use, and his actions still show a level of violence that could be interpreted as sexual in nature. More on this excerpt from 118. I don't blame porn, but when you fuse me using too much alcohol and mood-altering drugs, then the porn material shaped and molded my behavior. Could that have been what Bryan underlined? Even if it's fake? It's such a weird thing to write. Such a weird fan fiction type. The rest of the page says, and I'm warning you, the most damaging kinds of porn are those books, magazines, and movies that involve violence and sexual violence, because the marriage of those forces, along with booze and drugs, bring out the hatred that is just too horrific to describe. I mean, who wrote this? I've been searching for this guy. I mean, it's supposedly a Dr. Paul Dawson, and I looked on LinkedIn and I see a Paul Dawson and I see that photo, but of course it could be someone just using that person's photo. So I find that very, very strange. It will be interesting if in Discovery we learn that's the book Bryan may have had. Or could it be this other book? Coming in a close second option, maybe number one, Anne Rule, her book. She really knew Ted Bundy, and she wrote a book about him. And just like Bryan fooled his professor, Katherine Ramsland, who never imagined he would be the kind of killer he turned out to be, Ted Bundy totally fooled true crime writer Anne Rule. Those are more similarities where I'm like, aha. And once we get to what Katherine Ramsland has said about Bryan, of course, we're waiting for her to speak more interviews, but how polite she said he was. And knowing him 4 years, it's so strange to me because other women especially talked about, oh my goodness, just how rude and condescending Bryan was to them, especially females. And even in this documentary, not the one coming up on Amazon Prime, the one I've already watched on Peacock, I might do a separate video going over that whole thing. One girl was still so afraid of Bryan Kohberger. She was one of his students at WSU. She would not put her face to the camera, and she literally said, because I'm afraid of Bryan. Let's talk about how Ted Bundy fooled Anne Rule before we talk about Bryan fooling Dr. Katherine Ramsland. Ted Bundy, back in the day, this notorious serial killer, very charming, good-looking, a chameleon. His looks would change. People literally said his eyes changed colors. I've heard that before from people who experienced just real life murders around them, just like Ted Bundy's was. His blue eyes would go black. I've heard it before, and I believe people when they say it. I believe it's something beyond the super dilation of pupils. I believe it's true evil. So we know that Ted Bundy just essayed in the worst way, beat, killed at least 30 women in the 1970s. Could have been more. You know, we talked about last video about this. Ted Bundy could have started as early as 1969, his entire killing spree. But he was so charming and smart and good looking that he used those wits to throw his victims off. You know, they wouldn't suspect him. And what's so weird is that true crime writer Anne Rule, she had a friendship with Ted Bundy, you know, before she knew who the heck he really was. Her biography is titled The Stranger Beside Me from 1980. So this is how she met Ted. Anne was volunteering at the Self-Harm Prevention Center. It was a hotline in Seattle in 1971. And isn't it odd, she worked alongside Ted Bundy. Young and handsome, what was he doing at a self-harm prevention hotline? So Anne would later write, I have pondered on that coincidence in the years since, wondered why I should have been the one out of 51 volunteers to spend so much time with Ted Bundy. Also, like, why was he there? Anyway, Anne described how she saw many of the qualities in him that he would go on to use to exploit the trust of his victims. Bundy seemed kind, he was well-spoken, he was charming and handsome, and Anne quickly became friends with Bundy. She wrote, I liked him immediately. It would have been hard not to. As I read this, I see similarities in some of Bryan's actions. Well, we know Bryan is well-spoken, he's smart. Some people might think he's handsome, but He wasn't charming. Like, I believe he had this awkward, off-putting way, that intense stare that would throw people off. But this is interesting. Anne said that Bundy, he always insisted on seeing me safely to my car when my shift was over in the wee hours of the morning. He often told me, be careful, I don't want anything to happen to you. With Bryan, that may have been kind of similar, but also kind of opposite. We know the woman that he had those friendship interactions with at WSU, he kind of pretended to be her protector in terms of helping her install that security cameras or whatever in her home, in her apartment. But later she realized, oh no, he might be spying on me. He might be breaking in my apartment and moving stuff around, like the pie I burned moved somewhere else. And Bryan also followed one woman to her car, according to Dateline, at WSU. We don't know if this was the same woman, but it made her so uncomfortable. This is right before, apparently, he was heading back to Pennsylvania, not being able to keep his teacher's assistant job at WSU, his whole world probably crashing down, because what benefits did that job give him? Did he know he wouldn't be able to continue his schooling without it? Anyway, back to Bundy. As far as his appeal for women, I can remember thinking that if I were younger and single, or my daughters were older, this would be almost the perfect man. So obviously Anne was older than Bundy. I'm not sure by how many years, but she thought he was such a sweet, perfect guy that if she were younger and single, he would have been a perfect mate, or if her daughters were older, she wouldn't mind marrying one of them off to Bundy. Now this says when Bundy began killing in 1973, but again, people surmise it might have been as early as 1969. So Anne knew him, she's working with him for a couple of years by this point. So she's seen him, she loves this guy. She was working alongside him for 2 years, and all these killings started happening in the area. So it's 1973. Anne, who was an ex-policewoman, she started piecing together the evidence, like what's going on here. Page 118 on Anne Rule's book. It says, Reed, a tall, lean man with the irrepressible humor of a practical joker, had been in the homicide unit longer than any of the other 17 detectives. He'd become a close friend. I knew I could count on him to be discreet, to run a motor vehicles department check on the computer on Ted without making a big deal out of it. So Anne had this, hookup, this connect with the motor vehicles department to check on Ted. And this is what she wrote on page 118. I called him and began haltingly. I don't really think this is anything, but it's bugging me. I have a good friend named Ted. He's about 27 and he matches the description. So Bryan was 27, at least around 27 when these murders were committed. And he matches the description, and he used to live out by the university. But I don't know where he is now. Listen, I don't even think he has a car because I used to give him rides. So that's how she didn't know about this bronze Volkswagen Ted had, or it didn't come to the top of her mind. She wrote, and I don't want this to be like I'm turning him in or anything. I just want to know if he has a car now. Can you do that? So her friend was helping her out. Sure, he answered. What's his name? I'll run it through the computer. If he has a car registered to him, it will show. His name is Ted Bundy, B-U-N-D-Y. Call me back, okay? So her phone rang. 20 minutes later, it was Dick Reed, Theodore Robert Bundy. He gave Anne the address. Would you believe it's a 1968 bronze Volkswagen? And that's when she thought he was teasing her. Come on, Reed, what does he really drive? He doesn't even have a car, does he? Anne, I'm serious, he said. He's currently listed at that address and he drives a bronze Bug. I'm going to go out and drive around the block and see if I can spot it. Anne wrote, Reed called me back later that afternoon and said he hadn't been able to find the car parked near the house on 12th Northeast, which should be in Seattle. He said he would go a step further. I'm going to send to Olympia and get a driver's license picture of him. I'll pass it on to the county. So I don't know what happened on the next page, but it's like that tip was obviously never followed through. It was never completely run down because Ted was not brought into custody until quite some time later. I would have to actually see her whole book, read her book, to know how that turned out. But if this is the page 118 that Bryan found interesting enough, if he even had this book, what would he have underlined? The fact that Ted was 27, matches the description, lives out by the university. This is not WSU. I know some people mix up University of Washington with WSU. Was it Bundy's name, address? how he didn't get caught at this point, I don't know. She wrote, I kept on trying to find the answer to the awful puzzle, believing that the killer, when he was found, would prove to be a man with a record of violence, a man who never should have been allowed to walk the streets, someone who must surely have shown signs of a deranged mind. Just like many people do, Anne had this vision in her head of some crazed killer, some deranged man. But in the meantime, Ted Bundy was so bold, police learned that Ted had given his real first name to some of the women he tried to kidnap. Just how bold was this guy? Plus, he was driving such a unique car. He really thought he could get away with murder, and unfortunately, he really did, even though so many tips flowed into police. So Anne called the homicide unit, and she said, I don't really think this is anything, but it's bugging me. His name is Ted Bundy, B-U-N-D-Y. Call me back, okay? So obviously, even though she thought Ted was this great guy, oh, she would marry him off to her daughters, whatever, she started getting inklings, especially when it comes to the car. One of the key leads police had at the time was that whoever this suspect was, going around killing all these women, he drove a Volkswagen Beetle. The color was an unusual bronze color. And he called Anne back. He reported back to her, would you believe he drives a 1968 bronze Volkswagen Bug Beetle? Ted must have not driven this car around Anne. She didn't know. At some point she forgot he bought a Volkswagen. So when the cop called Anne with this info, she said, I thought he was teasing me. The information was correct, but Anne said, I forgot about it. I didn't lend much weight to the fact that Ted had acquired a Volkswagen. So she realized he bought one. And remember, this is back in the days where there's no internet, there's no blasting a VW Bug, bronze colored, all around social media where everyone can see it, everyone can know who they're on the lookout for. All these surveillance photos of Ted Bundy, it didn't exist. Information took a lot longer to get around. But when Anne saw a composite picture of the suspect, she said, I saw a resemblance to someone I knew. I put it in the back of my mind, told myself that I too was being caught up in the hysteria of that long, terrible summer. Now, I know that sounds crazy too. However, Ted Bundy was really a chameleon. In me researching these latest videos, going back and pulling photos from decades ago, I literally had to ask myself, wait, is that the same guy? This is Ted Bundy? First of all, I didn't even know he had blue eyes until I saw that color photo of his eyes. And then different ones, he looks so different. Different ones, he looks like a totally different man. I know he used that to his advantage, sometimes growing maybe a scraggly beard or mustache, looking unkempt. Other times, he lost a ton of weight. I remember, I think he got down to 145 pounds or less just to shimmy through a ceiling or something. And he was an escape artist too. So I don't blame Anne for not necessarily recognizing Ted from the composite photo, whatever one they showed her, because even witnesses, there was at least one witness, one survivor, they gave her a hard time because when she saw a photo of him, she was like, no, I don't think that's the guy who attempted to kidnap me or whatever his crime was with her. The head of the search and rescue group for Washington State also teased Ted about his being a look-alike for the Ted police were looking for, but nobody meant it seriously. Can you believe that? This Washington State leader, the head of the search and rescue, is teasing Ted Bundy like, hey, you look a lot like that guy Ted they're searching for. That's how much people just didn't believe it could be this charming, good-looking guy going around harming so many people. So Anne wrote, the last time I'd seen him, I knew that he lived at 4123 12th Avenue Northeast, only blocks from so many of the missing girls. Now, I'm assuming she means in Seattle. I looked it up. I was like, oh my goodness, what does it look like now? But police didn't recognize Anne's tip as something that they followed up on, or obviously they didn't, track it down, run it down. Bundy went on to hurt and kill so many more women. Now, even though Bundy was caught several times, but he went on to be caught in 1965 for a kidnapping, Anne continued her friendship with Bundy until eventually he would be incarcerated. So Anne wrote, I knew that he was a prime suspect, but that's all I knew at the time. I had no knowledge at all beyond the few innuendos I read in the papers. So she's like, okay, they're suspecting him, but I don't know how many killings had happened at that time. I don't know if she knew the brutality of them all or if her curious mind took over. There was an interesting quote next to one of her photos. Gentle people are fascinated often with the cruelest. I found that really interesting. Some people are like, why do you care about true crime? Why do you care about these criminals? And that was like, wow, that really, kind of like Bryan's teacher, Dr. Ramsland, said, some people will come and study criminology. They want to go on to be perhaps law enforcement agents or whatever. And some people are there like Bryan for nefarious reasons, hiding their real intent, learning how to get away with murder, or at least attempting to. Maybe that's one reason Anne was fascinated with Bundy. She wrote to him while he was in jail. She was even hoping that he would confess his crimes to her. That's pretty logical. We've seen Chris Watts give a confession of sorts to an author before he confessed to the FBI in 2019. And that's why I'm thinking, when Dr. Ramsland eventually, if she does get in contact with Bryan, if he allows her an interview, he might eventually confess his crimes to her, or he could just jerk her around, who knows. Anne wrote, I tried literally to save his life. Now, did she know Bundy had done what he'd done, or did she believe he was wrongly imprisoned? She wrote, I began to phone Washington state agencies to try and arrange something that would allow Ted to confess to me, and through plea bargaining, to be returned to Washington for confinement in a mental hospital. Ooh. When I read that, I was like, oh my goodness, can you imagine Bundy in a mental hospital? He would have escaped so easily. I mean, he already escaped the institutions easily enough, the law enforcement agencies. Ted Bundy maintained his innocence up until his execution became inevitable, even though he never truly confessed the full extent of his killing. And people still don't know his total number of victims or when he actually started. So I don't think Ted ever gave a full confession to anyone. He was sentenced to death by the electric chair. And then finally, 10 years later, on January 24th, 1989, Ted was executed. Now, Anne talked to CNN in 1999. She said, people like Ted can fool you completely. I'd been a cop, had all that psychology, but his mask was perfect. She said, I say that long acquaintance can help you know someone, but you can never be really sure. Scary. So I guess he did pull the wool over her eyes, maybe with her knowing Ted. Maybe he was like, I'm innocent, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. And maybe she just believed him. I don't know for how long. How long did she believe him? And maybe it's the same thing, the same type of psychology that fooled Dr. Ramsland. Obviously, she's a long-term study in criminology, and Bryan fooled her. She didn't start suspecting him really until she heard his flimsy alibi. Perhaps that's why Bryan Kohberger has so many fans of sorts. When people insist on being not guilty and pleading as such, certain people just start to believe he couldn't have done this. Anne Rule died in 2015. She had published 35 true crime books, many of them bestsellers. She had some famous ones. I saw one, at least one I know, went on to be a very successful movie. So this is well before all these Netflix documentaries and true crime on YouTube. All we had were books, basically. I remember the first true crime book of sorts I read when I was a little girl. It was called And I Don't Want to Live This Life. It was about Sid Vicious murdering his girlfriend, Nancy Spungen. Sid Vicious was with this group called the Sex Pistols. It was a big case, I guess, overseas. But that was kind of like my start in true crime, the interest in it, trying to figure out why. Anne's publisher was Simon & Schuster. They said she reinvented the true crime genre and earned the trust of millions of readers who wanted a new and empathetic perspective on the tragic stories at the heart of her works. Indeed, some people do want a balanced, as true as you can find it, outlook of a person to try and figure out why. People don't always just want to read this extreme perspective. You monster, you did this, rotten hell. Although I can't blame people who feel that way, especially family members of the victims. But no wonder Anne was popular. And so now I'm wondering, is Bryan Kohberger's Anne Rule, is that Dr. Catherine Ramsland to him? Dr. Ramsland is famous for working with the BTK killer, the serial killer known as Dennis Rader. She co-authored with him a book, Confessions of a Serial Killer, the untold story of Dennis Rader, the BTK killer. And she talked to Brian Enton of News Nation recently. Hopefully she'll speak to others whenever the gag order drops. She said, I want to understand how he was able to completely fool me. She wanted to know how Bryan pulled the wool over her eyes. And she would agree to study him. She said, if he wanted to do that, I would. This is what we do to try and look at developmental trajectories, the triggers, so that we can see red flags faster. We can prevent people like this from wreaking the havoc that they do. I really hope that's true. I really hope this work can help people. You hear one side, a vocal minority, oh, these grifters, Vicky Ward and James Patterson writing this book coming up, and oh, Netflix, and oh, Dateline, and oh, these authors. But people don't realize it literally takes so much time and effort to dig into people, to dig into the crime records, to dig into court records, to get the story right, to write the script, to present it on TV, to give interviews. I think a lot of people understand that. But it's interesting that Catherine Ramsland said about Bryan, I know he has the intellectual capacity to do it, to be self-reflective, to help think through how his life came to this. And so I would definitely do it if he were willing. And it would be hard, but I think because I have so much material from him, so she has a lot of his papers, I guess, I have questions for him that I think nobody else but me could ask. So I don't know if she's able to, of course, publish his papers, or maybe she can reference what she knows about Bryan. After all, she knew him for 4 years, taught him in a lot of classes, a lot of coursework. So she would have that paradigm, that viewpoint, that insider knowledge of him. And of course, part of me hates it because when I think about Bundy and the attention that he wanted, I compare him to Bryan maybe wanting to be notorious. How long had he been planning the 1122 King Road killings? Was it a plan for years? Did he specifically choose DeSales University knowing he would eventually commit these murders? Or did he not know until he went to WSU? What was the start of his horrible plan? Was it a long-term, evil plan? So Dr. Ramsland met Bryan. He's now, of course, 30 years old, but she met him way back in 2018. He started that 4-year program at DeSales University. He was a psychology major on the forensics track. Dr. Ramsland said he selected the forensic track, which made him an advisee for me. He seemed eager to be in the classroom. He was polite, he was respectful, intense, and curious, and there was no reason for me to think that he was anything other than someone who was really interested in this potential career. And that's just wild to me, all those positive attributes she saw in Bryan. Dr. Ramsland said Bryan was always really quite respectful and grateful. He would thank me for things. He was attentive. He would do the work. I didn't have any concerns. Now, isn't it odd that during all those 4 years, Bryan apparently never challenged Dr. Ramsland? Granted, maybe did he respect older women? Did he respect women in authority like Dr. Ramsland? Did he respect her because he knew, okay, if I want to get through DeSales and get through my plan, I have to be kind to this woman, polite and respectful. You juxtapose that with him going out to WSU, and you hear so many reports of him just being combative, especially to women, giving women a hard time. I don't know if it was young and old. I don't know if it was a man or a woman that they talk about he really, butted heads with out there in WSU. We'll know more. But he was very respectful to Dr. Ramsland. She taught him in 4 different classes, including an introduction to forensic psychology and one on death investigation. She taught him in a class on behavioral criminology and another class called Dangerous Minds, the psychology of antisocial behavior. So I'm sure Bryan knew a lot about antisocial behavior, but I think that death investigation would be very interesting too. I believe he wrote a paper for that class. I don't know if we'll ever get to read these papers or whatever, but I'm sure it gave Bryan so much insight on how to, hide your DNA, at least try to. Thank God his was left on that snap of the knife sheath. Did he wear gloves? Did he take off gloves? I wonder. Now, there's also a New York Times article published July 2nd, the day Bryan entered his guilty plea, talking about Dr. Ramsland being his professor and how she first found out the news that Bryan was arrested. So the news first came in a phone call. Dr. Ramsland, one of the country's most prominent experts on serial killers, she got a call from a colleague like, look, your former student has been arrested. These 4 University of Idaho students have been stabbed to death. Ramsland was completely stunned, and she doubted it could even be true. She says, I thought, they have to have this wrong. This has to be wrong. It's not the Bryan Kohberger that I know. So just like Anne probably never thought initially this charming Ted Bundy could be this crazy serial killer, Dr. Ramsland, like, no, not the Bryan Kohberger I know. This one Bryan Kohberger who got this master's degree in criminal justice in 2022 from DeSales. And she wrote about all these killers. Dr. Ramsland probably thought, yeah, I know killers inside and out. I know what to look for. I know the red flags. But she did say, yeah, maybe some people take my classes in order to move on to the killer track, not just the police person track. But again, she said Bryan was very polite, respectful. He seemed genuinely engaged with the material as a potential researcher, teacher, somebody who was interested in a career. And that's what I wonder too. Was Bryan so engaged in this career because in learning this track because he really did want to make it a career? Remember there was that he was trying to be an intern with the Pullman Police Department and that didn't fly. And then he got out to WSU, and when things went sideways, when he wasn't getting along with people, it was all this brouhaha over the low grades he gave or just the way he treated people. And then when he was losing his TA job, is that when he started plotting kind of like revenge? Was it revenge against the area, or was this something he had planned all along? I really hope Discovery gives us more clues about when he started planning this. Did he plan this horrific tragedy, this horrific crime way back in Pennsylvania, or was it something that came about in the last few months he spent in Washington, with his career failing and realizing, okay, if I can't be a TA anymore, it's failure. I can't come back to WSU and complete this track that I'm on. I can't be a TA anymore. I'm losing respect, losing face. What was it? After Kohberger got arrested in December 2022, Dr. Ramsland naturally expected Bryan to just clear his name. But then she found it weird he wasn't offering any kind of solid alibi. So it took, we heard all this time, Ann Taylor, Bryan's lawyer, oh, he has an alibi. It took more than a year for this alibi to come out. Oh, Bryan had just been, driving around middle of the night, stargazing on a cloudy night. That was the alibi that, Ann Taylor was hanging her hat on? We thought maybe it had been something more solid. Would it be like, oh, Bryan was with this person, or Bryan can clearly be seen here or something? No, it was weird. And Dr. Ramsland thought that was a weird and weak alibi too. She said, I thought that's not an alibi, and it's not. She taught this man for 4 years. Now, she had declined interviews before, of course, because she thought she'd be a witness in the trial, but now she's come out, and I think she's still waiting for the gag order to drop, maybe to start up interviews again. I think she hasn't given any interviews beyond Bryan Enton as of this point. Now, she won't talk about Bryan's specific schooling. There's certain laws about that. But she did talk about it not being weird that the Reddit user named Bryan Kohberger, was asking people, if you've spent time in prison, you've committed a crime, fill out this survey. Let me know certain things. He was this student investigator then. He wanted to know people's thoughts, emotions, and actions from the beginning to the end of the crime commission process. So Dr. Ramsland was saying, okay, yeah, that might look sus when you're looking back on it. It could look really suspicious knowing what we know about Kohberger now. But in the criminology department, those kind of surveys are just commonplace for decades. Dr. Ramsland said after Bryan got arrested, she did reach out to his family to offer support, but she said they haven't remained in touch. So I don't know if she spoke with them a little bit or not at all. She has not talked to Bryan since the spring of 2022, prior to the murders. But she is willing to connect with him if he's willing to connect with her. And she did say it made sense to her that he decided to enter a guilty plea instead of going to trial. She said, I wasn't surprised by the plea once the judge took away every option, that he couldn't use his alibi. Well, there was really no alibi to use, just stargazing on a cloudy night. And he couldn't use an alternate suspect. There's nothing left. And those alternate suspects, may I tell you, I mean, the judge, I love Judge Hippler for this. He blew through those alternate suspects. Again, all this time we kept waiting, oh, it's something. And then the judge just blew through whoever those people Bryan's defense was trying to throw under the bus, probably willing to throw them, whoever they are, give them so much shade and death threats and Lord knows what. But what did the judge call that? I think the judge called that flimsy. The judge had very harsh and direct words for Ann Taylor in terms of those alternate suspects. So Dr. Ramsland said there was nothing left. Basically, Bryan couldn't use this flimsy alibi. He couldn't throw shade at these alternate suspects, I'm sure, who had nothing to do with Bryan's crime. And she said, and now he's facing a lot of evidence piled up and the death penalty, so it did not surprise me. So she understands his choice to go ahead and plead guilty. And hopefully it's not in some conspiratorial type of way, which I'm sure it's not for her. Some people, of course, are going down this wild line of thinking that, oh, Bryan was forced to plead guilty even though he's innocent and blah, blah, blah. Now, there's an Amazon Prime documentary coming. That new Amazon Prime doc. It's called One Night in Idaho, The College Murders. So it'll premiere this Friday, July 11th, 2025. So I'm ready to watch that. I plan to hopefully make an entire video with us discussing that too. It focuses, of course, on the horrific tragedy in 2022, and it's based on the book coming out right after it. 2 days later, it's based on the book, The Idaho 4, An American Tragedy by James Patterson and Vicki Ward. And by the way, people are like, oh, whatever, they don't know anything. Even the excerpts coming out, some people are challenging. James Patterson and Vicki Ward are excellent writers from what I've read thus far, seemingly excellent researchers. They talk to like 300 people. Do you know how long it takes to do 300 interviews? Anyway, some people aren't believing anything. Vicki Ward interviewed this woman. We read the excerpt, my last video. This woman, her son died of an overdose. She knew the Kohbergers. They were next door neighbors, and she talked about her experience running into Michael Kohberger, Bryan's father, last summer. And Michael at that point was still believing in his son's innocence, believing his son would have his name cleared. Some people, no matter what you put out, any little excerpt, they're like, oh, that can't be true and blah, 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 blah. But I'm grateful to see that some people are literally putting their faces out there, with their names. They're going in these documentaries, standing up and saying, look, this is what I know about the situation, about the victims. The Peacock documentary did a great job sitting down with several young ladies who knew the victims and offered a side of them, that wasn't just the Idaho 4. It, explained their quirks and their personalities and their attributes and all these positive things. So I like that. So people can't claim, oh, every single person who appears in one of these documentaries is a flake or whatever. I don't know why some just take such a hard line when it comes to some killers, confessed killers, where they still have to think everything's a conspiracy. Nothing's right. They can't have the right person. I don't understand it. I did see the cast in one of these documentaries, this Amazon Prime one coming up. I noticed it said Dylan Mortensen plays herself. And I was like, oh my goodness, is she really going to appear in this documentary? Or are they just using like previous footage of her somewhere? You know how they use previous footage from social media or whatever, and then they might have given her credit that way. But it would be interesting if she did appear. I doubt that she would appear. She would have been the star witness. So likely she wouldn't have talked, but I don't know. We'll see. Some other important witnesses have shown up in these documentaries. So I'm really looking forward to this. It's an exploration of the emotional twists and turns of this American tragedy. It will feature exclusive access to people connected to the victims. Now, speaking of that documentary based on this popular book that's on the way, the one I've already, again, pre-ordered, The Idaho 4, An American Tragedy, to be published July 14th. So, in essence, that's a week from today as I film this. Hopefully we can just start talking about it that day. So I started researching because libraries already have this book on hold and so many people are on the wait list. I checked, my different local libraries. I saw there's so much interest in this book. I was even checking Libby, which is like an ebook digital system for libraries. I didn't see it available anywhere near me, but if you want to get the book too and you don't want to, go to Amazon and purchase it, always check your local library, not only for the hardcovers, but if they have digital ebooks, you might be able to get it there. But I saw people were like already 8, 10 on the waiting list, for the book. And on Amazon, it's surging. The book is probably higher than this now. Number 585 in the Kindle store. It'll probably hit the top 100 this week, I'm sure. Number 1 in violence in society. Number 1 in mass murder biographies and memoirs. So this book, I don't think it's some fly-by-night grift. I think it's a deep look at people who knew Bryan or the victims or the situations, and so many people can give so much insight. Now, the other documentary was a Peacock documentary. I already watched that. It was called The Idaho Student Murders. That one was really good too. One thing that's so amazing about, just kudos to this graphic artist, whoever did the one sheet, the cover for the Idaho Student Murders Peacock documentary, they have a profile of Bryan Kohberger like staring down into this black space, and it looks like the shape of Idaho, as if he's looming down on that state, knowing the havoc he's going to wreak there. But that was really good too. I might do a separate video about that too. It's like an hour and a half. The Idaho Student Murders documentary, some people were mixing the two up because there's so many that have already come out and so many that will continue to come out, I'm sure, in the wake of him pleading guilty and as we get more evidence. Since I pay like almost $60 a year for the version of Peacock TV where you still have to watch the commercials and everything, I just went ahead and watched it. It was good. And thank God we have Amazon Prime, so I'm primed to watch that one too. And then I'm wondering if you saw that excellent Inside the Idaho 4 Murders, that 3D timeline. I can link to it below, and all the sources I like to put below, links to what I'm talking about. But that woman who created the 3D rendering for Dateline, and we even see the surveillance video of the white Elantra, the white car driving around the house. It's excellent. She did a great job, just really for the first time, because I like to see it so much visually, especially that house. It's difficult to reconcile, but how Bryan likely entered and going up the stairs and then going down, it really gives you a good visual of what could have happened. So for now, let's close with 1 Thessalonians 4:14. For if we believe that Jesus died and rose again, as in fact he did, even so God, in the same way, by raising them from the dead, will bring with him those believers who have fallen asleep in Jesus. That really gives you hope. Gives me so much hope when we talk about these types of tragedies, and you feel so much for the loved ones, and it gives hope reading that Jesus will bring with him those believers who have fallen asleep in Jesus, which means, when we meet our maker, when we meet our time, even if it's a violent end, no matter what kind of end, you can take hope in the fact that you'll see them again. Like I know Steve Gonzalez, he always wears that cross. I believe he's a believer, and maybe even though, of course, he's really angry, and I don't blame him for wanting to see Bryan face that firing squad, and I don't blame the other parents who are satisfied with the plea bargain. Whatever their response is, they're the parents of the victims. But hopefully, verses like that can comfort people in knowing they will see their loved ones again. As believers in Christ, we don't have to despair. I hate to hear when people say, I will never see that person ever again in life. Like I can't imagine feeling that way about those who've gone on, my mom, my dad, or, I just hold on to the hope that I will see them again because it says it. What do you think the book is going to be? That Bryan Kohberger had it sounds like a literal printed copy. They're not talking about any type of ebook here. I mean, it doesn't say ebook. Obviously, it was underlined, but of course you can highlight on Kindles and stuff. But it sounds like a literal book, a book with underlining on page 118. Maybe it's neither of these books. Maybe it's some criminology book from his class that we don't even know about? Or could it have been what Reddit users guessed? Could it be the weird fake book, The Masks of Ted Bundy, My Prison Interviews with the All-American Psycho, Ted Bundy, or The Stranger Beside Me? So anyway, I think that's it. I wanted to keep the books theory all in one video, and then I want to move on potentially to breaking down and discussing these documentaries coming out. And one thing, at the end of that documentary, the Peacock one thus far, they did have enough time to, put a little blurb at the end, text on the screen, Bryan has entered a guilty plea. Because obviously all these interviews took place and the people are talking about, well, when we go to trial and if, I have to testify, or they're speaking like that. They don't know yet that there's a guilty plea, of course, entered. And I expect the same thing to happen with this Amazon Prime documentary, One Night in Idaho, The College Murders. And of course, the same thing with the book. It's definitely already gone to the publishers. We've seen the hard copy Vicky Ward has. She's shown it in her video. So obviously, they don't have all this new information in the hard copy yet. Maybe in the Kindle version, of course, they can put a blurb at the end if it's not too late to say, Bryan has entered a guilty plea. But I expect all these 300 interviews we'll see in the book and the doc will talk about people anticipating him going to trial. Probably hardly anyone anticipated him, after all these years, entering a guilty plea. It's something we say and we hope in the back of our mind, but sometimes a person who wants to change their plea from not guilty to guilty, sometimes they do it earlier. Like Chris Watts, committed those horrible murders in August 2018, and pretty soon after he entered his guilty plea. But I guess other people, it does take time. They want to say, not guilty, we're gonna fight, blah, blah, blah. And over time, once they see the evidence against them and these flimsy excuses, these flimsy alibis, these not alternate suspects, when it doesn't fly and they get literally closer to facing a firing squad, then they're like, okay, reality sets in and they change their plea. Sometimes. After, all these years. It happened. We'll see what these new documentaries, what the new book brings us, what info, and especially what evidence we'll get from Discovery to just let us know more. Thank you so much for watching all this. Stay tuned, of course, for more updates about this case and many other cases. Take care.